Thank you, Rich, and thank you again to the Strand for putting on this wonderful evening. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing and interviewing the author of this incredible new book, Dog Whistle Politics. Ian Haney López is the Bolt Law Professor at the UC Berkeley School of Law, which I proudly attended and was a graduate. He is also the newest Senior Fellow at Demos. He's the author of the fantastic law book called White by Law, which you should all check out if you haven't. And I really don't want to spend too much more time before we dig right into this book. So, Professor López, I am going to pretend like I haven't read this book multiple times, which I have. I'm going to put myself in the shoes of a reader who is, walking by this book on the book stand, on the shelves, and ask you a few questions about the cover. Because what good would a book about race be if we couldn't judge it by its cover? So first, what is Dog Whistle Politics?
I do like the irony of judging a book about race by its cover. First, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Strand. And thank you, all of you, for being here. I really appreciate it. Dog Whistle Politics. It's a term that I think most of you have heard. It's latent in the political discussion. It signals coded racial appeals used to attract voters in a way that on the surface allows plausible deniability, not really about race at all, but underneath is clearly agitating racial anxiety. And so you can think of terms like welfare queen, Obama is a food stamp president, I would say a term like illegal alien. All of these you can use, and if you're pressed, you can deny that you had any racial intent whatsoever. But in fact, the main purpose of these terms is to trigger a sense of racial threat from minorities. And now, so we have a sense that that term is out there. What I want to do with this book is push a thesis that I don't think is widely appreciated. It's not just that dog whistle politics is out there in a vestigial way or a marginal way. What I'm saying is, dog whistle politics is the primary way to understand the dramatic shift in the United States from being a country that embraced liberalism, that embraced the New Deal, to a country that now is quite conservative politically, and I'm including both Democrats and Republicans, so much so that many people refuse to say that they're liberals. That seems too radical, that seems too extreme, and I'm saying we need to figure out how that happened, and it's not the exclusive reason, but I do want to make the very strong claim it's the primary reason. Coded race baiting is the primary reason the political spectrum has shifted remarkably to the right, away from New Deal liberalism, away from a government that's interested in the middle class, and towards a government that's mainly serving the rich.
All right. So I'm going to stay with this cover idea for a minute. Again, I'm just walking by and I see something in red underneath Dog Whistle Politics, and it's how coded racial appeals. What are you trying to do by signifying that right on the book cover?
So coded racial appeals, here's what's important to realize. Race couldn't be working this way if racism hadn't evolved since the Civil Rights Movement. Right? The Civil Rights Movement had a tremendous success in driving out from public discourse open racial slurs. Now, it's near political suicide to use a slur in public as a politician. But that doesn't mean that race has gone away. It has simply evolved. It's taken a new form. Public racism now always operates on two levels. On one level, it's triggering racial panic. On another, it's establishing plausible deniability. So this is the dog whistle idea. And what I'm saying is, it's not just in politics. This is the new public racism, always operating on two levels. One, coded references, typically about culture, sometimes about religion, about bad behavior, that trigger racial anxiety, but that on the other hand allow conservatives to say, we didn't mention race, we didn't say black, we didn't say Mexican, we can't possibly be accused of racism.
And that is that reinventing racism idea. And there's another piece in the book that you call common sense racism that I think is actually new to the lexicon. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. So Heather has actually jumped to, I think, the most difficult idea here, or not the most difficult, the most pressing. Here's the question. How is it that racism is working now to convince many white voters to support policies that are really quite bad for themselves, right? And let's frame it this way.
In 2012, Mitt Romney promised that he would cut taxes for the rich, that he would further deregulate the economy even after the financial sector had imploded the whole economy, that he would slash social services in the midst of a tremendous economic crisis. And now, while it's true he lost, he did not lose among whites. Among whites, he won 3 out of 5 voters. Among whites, he carried every age cohort, including the young. He won among white men, he won among white women, and he won among white majorities in 46 states across the country. In the midst of an economic calamity, somebody promising tax cuts for the rich, slash social services for the rest of us, and a deregulated corporate marketplace won that percentage of votes. How did that happen? And so, and if the answer is race, then the next question is, but how can racism be working this way? And in particular, we should be clear, this is not a story of sort of hate every black person racism. This is not a story of bigotry. Right? I think some people caricature the Tea Party, caricature the Republicans by saying, it's a nest of bigots. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. I think Tea Party folks, I think Republican folks, they're us. They're people who are out there in the economy trying to make their way forward, trying to understand what's happened to them, and there's this powerful narrative out there. And the narrative is, minorities are doing this to you. Minorities have hijacked government. Minorities are taking over the schools. Minorities are taking over the streets, and government won't protect you, right? And now, I know that narrative is wrong, and you know that narrative is wrong, but that narrative is powerful. Why is it so powerful? And here we come to this idea of common sense racism. How precisely does racism work? Racism, for a lot of us, is the confluence of 3 factors. It is a confluence of cultural beliefs, sort of stereotypes, norms, the things you see in the media. It is a confluence of structural factors. We have a society that has been structured in terms of racial divisions for hundreds of years, and that means it is built into our environment. And that means, and here let's be clear, New York, as you go from one area of New York to another, you will pass from white spaces into non-white spaces and back to white spaces, right? That's built into the environment. I mean, it can be built into elite universities, it can be built into prisons. That environment itself is adding to the sort of common sense that race is real, that race is meaningful, right? So we've got culture, we've got structures, and the third is human cognition. Now, I think among liberals we talk a lot about implicit bias, and the notion there is the human mind jumps very quickly and automatically and unconsciously to categorizing people we see, and we categorize people in terms of race. I want to be very careful with this. I want to be clear. So a friend of mine said to me, yes, that's right, our reptilian brains think in terms of race. Absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. Our cognition, our minds think in terms of categories. We group people quickly and automatically and unconsciously. But which categories we use, that's a product of culture, right? We don't think necessarily in terms of race, we think in terms of difference. Now, what is one of the most salient differences in our society? Race. So when you put together culture, and especially a culture that is a culture that says minorities are threatening, and that culture is constantly being reinforced by conservative politicians and by the conservative media. Think of the drumbeat of messages being communicated by Fox News. When you put together those cultural meanings with an environment that tells us, you know what, race is real. When I walk through nice suburbs, they're overwhelmingly white. When I'm in inner cities and they're scary, they're overwhelmingly minority. Put those together, and then you put together the tricks of human cognition, you get a sense in which race is automatic. It's powerful, it's obvious, it is in a sense, it is common sense, right? And it's hard to get past all of that. It's that common sense operation of race that makes race so powerful in our society and so easy for politicians to trigger through coded racial appeals.
And that's where I think you get into the idea of strategic racism, which is the use of that racial territory for your strategic gain as a politician.
I think that's absolutely right. So we need to start talking about racisms. Race is a very complicated social phenomena. The idea that there's only one racism, clearly that's a mistake. We need to talk about racisms. I think when we talk about people who hear and respond to the whistle, for example, by voting for Mitt Romney, we're talking about good people who often are being manipulated in ways that they themselves do not appreciate. There's some remarkable social science showing that people who are responding to these appeals do not recognize them as racial. So, for example, if I say food stamps, I think a lot of us say, yeah, food stamps, you're clearly playing on race. But there are a lot of people who don't understand that and who don't see that, right? So I'm telling a story of common sense racism, which is really a story of good people being manipulated. But opposite that, I want to tell a very different story about the politicians and the think tanks and Fox News. I want to tell a story about people who are wordsmiths, people who are cultural poets, people who understand absolutely the register and power of the terms they use, the terms they invent. And I want to call this strategic racism. Here's the importance of strategic racism. Strategic racism is the purposeful manipulation of race, of racial animosity for one's own ends, to gain power, to gain votes, to gain status. Here's the core of it. It's not really about race. Strategic racism is not really about race. It's not about group hatred. It's not about the fiery emotions of hatred or fear or panic. It's not rooted in some deep-seated animosity. It's rooted in a cold, purposeful, thoughtful calculation of means and ends. If these people thought they could get votes by appealing to some other socially divisive characteristic, they would. Or let me start a different way. Sorry. If these people thought they could get votes by being honest about what their priorities were, they'd be honest. But they don't think they can get votes that way. Now they're looking around saying, I got to get elected. How do I get campaign cash? Maybe I'm going to go represent the corporations. I can't say, elect me, I'm going to be a defender of the corporate elite. What do I say? And they look around, and one of the most powerful things they can say is, minorities are out to get you. But it's not that they're racially prejudiced. That's not what's animating this. What's animating this is strategy. And it's exactly because it's strategic that it is powerful and that it very, very quickly adapts. Right? So we need to understand that racism is constantly adapting, and it's adapting precisely because there are people who are strategic racists who are not motivated by animus, but who are motivated by self-interest, thinking about how they can use racial divisions in society to further their own interests.
And this is a question that I think is really important for people who want to make a case for a response to what has happened to wreck the middle class, which is the last part of your title. They want to make a case that people are staying up late at night because they can't pay for childcare, they can't pay to put their kids through college, that they're working 3 jobs, that they have insecure health care and no retirement benefits to speak of. And all of the common sense solutions to that would require an active role for government. They do in other countries, they have in our past. And how is it that in your analysis, race is undermining that activist role for government?
That's a terrific question. Look, and let me answer it this way. Let me answer it by comparing 1964 to 1972. 1964, you have a campaign between Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is promising to continue and expand the New Deal, and he's promising also to extend it to non-whites as a reflection of the civil rights movement. He's saying these New Deal programs, which theretofore had primarily been for whites, we're going to open them up. We're going to create paths to prosperity, paths into the middle class for minorities as well.
Ian, can I just pause on that? How was it that the New Deal programs were primarily not open to non-whites? I just want to make sure that everyone's clear.
Sure, absolutely. This itself is a very telling history. The New Deal arises in response to the Great Depression. It puts together a coalition of northern blacks, of northeastern elites, of northern working class, but it also is a coalition that involves southern Democrats. And in order to put this coalition together, there has to be a compromise, and the compromise is that there's going to be these effective programs to build a middle class, but they're going to be limited in a way that primarily help whites, and that also are going to devolve certain programs to the states so that the states, if they wish, can use them in a way that limits or restricts the opportunity of African Americans and of Latinos to participate. Right? And this is Ira Katznelson, when affirmative action was white. This is part of the history of the New Deal. This begins to change in 1964. But still, in 1964, you have Lyndon Johnson representing an expansion of the New Deal. He's running against Barry Goldwater, who's promising effectively what Mitt Romney promised in 2012. and he loses in a crushing landslide, right? Except in the Deep South. In the Deep South, Barry Goldwater has been running on racial appeals. He's been promising that he's going to come out in favor of states' rights, which at the time meant the rights of southern states to resist integration. He's been promising that he's going to respect, quote, freedom of association, which everybody understands as the freedom of business owners to exclude African Americans. And in the South, he wins white majorities in 10 former Confederate states, and he wins 5 states outright, right? And this is a warning bell. And what it's warning is conservatism might triumph if it can be gift-wrapped in racial animosity, right? That's one. 2, Goldwater is also teaching that racial animosity needs to be coded, right? States' rights, freedom of association. These are terms we can understand as racial, but which Goldwater was quick to deny had any racial meaning whatsoever. They seemed like principle, like this is about federalism somehow, or libertarianism, right? Okay, fast forward to 1972. In the meantime, Richard Nixon has been elected in 1968. He wasn't all that convinced that sort of racial appeals could get him elected. He avoids it. By 1970, the logic has shifted. It has cemented. The number crunchers have spoken, and it's clear. Race can be used to divide the New Deal coalition. And so Nixon starts campaigning on a promise to end or slow down school integration in the South, and he starts campaigning for law and order. He starts campaigning against, quote, forced busing, right? As if busing were the issue rather than integration. And he wins in an overwhelming landslide. In 1964, 2/3 of whites vote to extend the New Deal. In 1972, 2/3 of whites vote effectively to end the New Deal when they vote for Nixon and his conservatism. Did we as a country change politically in our orientation towards activist government serving the middle class? Or did the polity flip because it came to understand that they were voting on the question of race? And what I'm saying is the shift that pushes us away from New Deal liberalism and towards this conservative politics is really being driven by race. Now, Nixon, I just want to be clear, Nixon was an opportunist both in terms of race and in terms of public policy, because he was actually in the sort of moderate Republican vein in 68 and in 70, and only became conservative when it could win him votes. Not Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980, he's an old-time Goldwater conservative, and he's going to combine sort of coded racial provocations and hostility towards the New Deal. And so you can see it in Nixon, you can see it coming. But the big shift, the big giveaways in terms of tax cuts to the rich and corporations, the attacks on civil rights, the attacks on unions, the attacks on the middle class, that really accelerates with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s.
And just to be bipartisan, Ian, can you talk a little bit about Bill Clinton in this book?
It's important to talk about Bill Clinton because Bill Clinton raises this larger question. How did the Democrats respond? How did they respond? Now, I said that the number cruncher spoke in 1970. By that, I meant in part Kevin Phillips, a Republican demographer, but I also mean some of the Democrats. The Democrats ran the numbers too, and they said, wow, if we're closely tied to race, we might start losing votes. What should we do? Flee from race. Get away from race. Stop being so closely associated with minorities, right? That idea of distancing, of the Democrats distancing themselves from race develops and is embraced as a route to electoral success by Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton is not just going to flee from race in terms of holding a distance between himself and African Americans. He's going to make a point to the polity at large that this is a new Democrat. This is a new Democratic Party that is not beholden to African Americans. And so there are going to be a couple of really dramatic instances of this. One is Bill Clinton is going to fly back to Arkansas to make sure that he's there and oversees the execution of a retarded African American man, so that no one could say that he was soft on crime. So no one could say, right, so that's one. Another, Clinton accepts an invitation to meet with Jesse Jackson at his conference, and there upbraids a young singer, a young rap artist, Sister Soldier. And it becomes clear that he's not talking to Jesse Jackson, he's not talking to the African Americans in the room, he's talking to white voters. Right? And he's saying to white voters, I'm not a Jesse Jackson Democrat, I'm independent of these people. Those are the sort of campaign gestures. Far more damaging is what Bill Clinton does in terms of policy. Ending welfare as we know it. Welfare was a key dog whistle term. Welfare connected with African Americans, and ending welfare as we know it was a way for him to say, this is the new Democratic Party and we're actually shifting to the right and we're not beholden to minorities anymore. Or Bill Clinton and the war on crime. Crime is another one of these tropes that comes out of dog whistle politics, and it has had huge destructive implications, especially minority communities here. I'd really like to say, if you haven't read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, she really walks through what happens. And in that process, she indicts Bill Clinton. He did much more than Ronald Reagan to boost a war on crime, because that showed that he was not just tough on crime, but by implication, tough on minorities, right? Bill Clinton is symptomatic of a Democratic response that has said, we can't beat the Republicans in terms of this dog whistle politics unless we ourselves beat them at it. We need to adopt it ourselves. And so you see the Democratic Party not just fleeing from race, but itself adopting dog whistle rhetoric. And that's been part of the dynamic that has shifted both parties to the right. Because it's not enough that you adopt the rhetoric. Now you got to follow through on the policies. And that's what we see during the Clinton years.
So Ian, it has been very interesting to me to see how much welfare, which you just talked about, has been a signature part of Republican campaigns during this period of time when welfare barely exists, right? And when, if you ask people, voters, what are their top 30 issues, welfare is not there. But Mitt Romney spent half of his ad budget on an ad that was, widely recognized to have been false about what President Obama was doing on welfare, that he was undoing welfare reform. Rick Scott campaigned in Florida, a place with lots of seniors, no state income tax, an incredible decimation of wealth from the foreclosure crisis, on drug testing welfare recipients. In my mind, that says something not about welfare policy, which is very rarely going to affect any voter directly, but about who government is working for and who is the threat to my security, and who, if I'm the politician saying that my principal goal is to make sure that welfare is tightened, whom I'm going to work for as I work in government.
I think that's absolutely right. So I think welfare has had an incredible staying power as a dog whistle term. I mean, you can think back. I mean, part of it was Nixon, but it was really Reagan and his idea of welfare queens. I mean, that really sort of gave it this energy. So it's had this incredible staying power. I want to think through a couple of other implications of welfare. One is, the story about welfare isn't just a story about minorities, because lurking behind the image of lazy minorities on welfare, there's another image that dog whistle politicians like to cultivate, and that's the image of the hardworking white. Right? And so Ronald Reagan, not only did he talk about welfare queens, but he also liked to tell a story about how you're standing in line to buy a hamburger, but you're behind a young fellow buying a T-bone steak with food stamps, right? And now, just in case I was too subtle in the South, he would say a strapping young buck, right? I mean, it was really quite ugly. But notice that there's two figures in that story. One is this lazy minority who's ripping you off, but the other is you, the hardworking white taxpayer, right? That's an essential part of the ingredients. So here Republicans are saying, when they're campaigning against welfare, they're saying, in effect, I stand with hardworking whites. I'm here to represent the interests of hardworking whites. Now, are they? Well, not if they're going to slash taxes for the rich, slash social services, slash infrastructure spending, and deregulate the economy. They're not. But by implicitly promising, I'm holding the line on welfare, they're implicitly saying, and many whites are hearing them at least unconsciously say, I'm with hardworking whites. That's one comment. Here's a second comment. What happens to you if you're white and your job goes away? The economy turns, you lose your job, you're on long-term unemployment, somebody in your family falls ill, You break a leg in the workplace, what happens to you? You need government help. You need government help. But how can you understand this? Because hardworking whites don't need government help, just lazy minorities do. So there's this phenomena that keeps confusing people. A lot of Tea Partiers were themselves on government assistance. They were getting unemployment, or they're getting Social Security. Were they grateful? Did that induce them to vote Democratic? No. They were furious. They were furious at government, that somehow it was government's fault that they had to be, that they needed help, that they needed to be picked up. How can we make sense of that? We make sense of it in terms of a racial rhetoric. People are being told, if you need help from government, you're a loser. And only losers need help from government. That's crazy. We learned something very different in the Great Depression. What we learned in the Great Depression is we're all in this together. And sometimes there are structural disruptions that harm all of us. And that everybody sometimes needs to be lifted up. And this is a tough time for anybody. You lose your job, you get sick, it's a tough time psychologically. There's a lot of messages out there saying somehow this is your fault. You don't need government piling on. You don't need Fox News piling on. You don't need cultural common sense piling on and saying, if you're out of work and you're on government assistance, you're just like a lazy minority, right? And yet that's the message that many whites are getting. They're internalizing it. And so they're deeply conflicted when in fact they need government help. And rather than saying, I need government help, everybody sometimes needs government help, and we need a government that's on the side of people and not on the side of the very rich, they say, I'm really furious with the Democrats, I'm going to go vote Tea Party, right? But that's the racial logic pushing through.
So just a couple quick questions more, and then we want to open it up to the audience. Colorblindness. Colorblindness has become the common sense understanding of the antidote to racism, right? And thank goodness Stephen Colbert sort of pokes fun at it all the time by saying, I don't see race. But I don't think people sort of laugh at that, but I don't think people really understand how powerful it is for him to refute that idea. So can you talk a little bit about how colorblindness has become a shield and a weapon as well? Absolutely.
Dog whistle politics and colorblindness are flip sides, and they work hand in hand. So think about dog whistle appeals. It says, you know, we're all being threatened by those criminals and by lowlifes and by welfare cheats. Colorblindness says the only time race exists is when somebody actually says the word race. So colorblindness says, you know, if you're talking about welfare cheats or illegal aliens, you're not talking about race. You're just talking about culture and behavior, right? So colorblindness is a shield for dog whistle politics, because colorblindness says race doesn't exist unless somebody names it. Now, who's naming race in the conversation?
You.
Well, you too. Right? It's right? Us, right? Those of us who are trying to fight the power of racism in American life are the ones who say the word race. And colorblindness says whoever says that word, they're the racist. Right? And so I like to say that what we're seeing is a punch, parry, and kick in American racial rhetoric. The punch is the coded racial appeals. It's constantly inserting racial innuendo into the conversation, talking about those people and welfare and illegal aliens and terrorists and Sharia and the heartland, constantly injecting that poison into the conversation. That's the punch. The parry is colorblindness. The parry is to say, racist? Me? Don't be ridiculous. I didn't say the word. You didn't hear me say black. I didn't use a racial slur. Colorblindness says racism is only when it's expressed, therefore I'm entirely innocent. And now, the kick. You liberals are pathetic and you insist on playing the race card all the time. And you're the real racist. You're the one sparking racial division. And in fact, didn't you just say the word race? And I got to say, yeah, I just said the word race. I said that, you know, you're being racially manipulative. And they say, aha, you're the racist. Right? Punch, parry, and kick. And that too is colorblindness, because colorblindness says the first express mention of race, that's the racism. Right? Now, I want to go a little bit deeper than that, because I think it's very important to understand colorblindness has an aura of sort of aspiration. And I think we ought to acknowledge that. I would like to see a colorblind society in the sense that race did not correlate to privilege or to disadvantage. Right? I'd like to see a society in which race wasn't a strong corollary to privilege and disadvantage. Okay? And colorblindness, the term itself, comes out of the civil rights movement. But here's what it meant in the civil rights movement. In the civil rights movement, colorblindness meant we should not treat people as if race is essential to their character. Right? And this is Martin Luther King saying, I want to see the content of the character, not the color of their skin. You don't treat people as if race determines their intelligence, their ability, their temperament. Right? That's a beautiful ideal. Conservative colorblindness says something different. It says, don't treat people as if race is a relevant social category. Don't notice race at all. Never treat it as if it's a relevant social category. But the civil rights movement was saying race is an incredibly relevant social category and we need to work actively to make it less salient. Conservative colorblindness today says race is an irrelevant social category, so don't talk about it and don't do anything about it. Right? And if you do try and do anything about it, let's say talk about existing racism or have an affirmative action program, that's racism. Because you've now noticed race, and conservatives are insisting that race has no social bearing. Obviously it does, right? Obviously it does. So I think we really want to acknowledge the aspirational quality of colorblindness, but then be quite clear about the way in which the liberal aspirational quality of colorblindness has been hijacked and has been completely turned on its head by a conservative version of colorblindness that uses colorblindness actually to protect constant racial insinuation.
So my final question is this. In 2008, this country voted for its first African-American president. And it was a watershed moment in American politics, without a doubt. It was a moment when I think many of us were hopeful that this country would finally see that our diversity is our greatest asset, and that it actually is going to take a lot of hard work to make a real, dare I say, demos out of people who come from all over the world and who have ancestors from every community in the nation, in the globe. And that America was up for that challenge. And there has been an incredible retrenchment in the discourse. It has left, I think, the left really reeling as to how to deal with this when their standard bearer has been unable to really articulate a way that is a conscious, working hard on the thorny issues of race, because he's been trapped, I think, in this dog whistle moment. So you do have a chapter on Obama, and I think we should end there. And if you can, talk a little bit about Obamacare and where we are now, that would be great.
Sure. So I want to... It's so important to acknowledge the election and re-election of an African-American president. It's so important because that really is a momentous, positive change in race in the United States. And I think a lot of us, we may rewrite our own personal histories. I myself did not think it was going to happen until about 3 days before it did, right? I mean, it just seemed so inconceivable. I think it's really important that we celebrate that moment. But I think it's important also that we understand that Obama's election in some ways is symptomatic of triumphs against racism that do not at all spell the end of racism, but rather of its mutation, of its shifting adaptation, right? And so we can have a black president and at the same time have a white political party. I mean, stop for a moment and think honestly about the Republican Party. It's a bit of an open secret, but we know this is essentially a party defined by race. 9 out of 10 voters for Mitt Romney were white. 98% of Republican elected officials are white. They've organized their politics around coded racial appeals. We have both an African-American president and a one of our two major political parties that has essentially defined itself by race, right? And so we need to understand we've triumphed against racism in some ways, but it remains incredibly potent in others. Now, Obama. I regret to say part of the reason race remains potent, I think, is because Obama, too, adopted the Democratic tactic of fleeing from race. He talked about race as little as possible. He talked about it only once in the campaign in his Philadelphia speech when he was forced to address it in the wake of the scandal around Reverend Wright. During his presidency, he has largely avoided any conversation about race. But I want to say it goes much further than that. I think President Obama is a very subtle, very sophisticated thinker on race, and I think he understands that as a black Democratic president, he's in particular risk of being demonized for embodying this narrative that conservatives have been telling of government by and for minorities. And I think that has led him to stay away from race, but I think it's also led him to stay away from liberal policies. Right? He has shied away from liberal policies because liberalism itself is associated with race. And so the cost to us is that we have a president who I think in 2008 had the best opportunity in a generation to interrupt a Republican narrative that said the problem in our society is grasping minorities. The best opportunity to say, look at what Republican nostrums have brought us. Look at where we are in terms of financial collapse and the wars abroad and trampled constitutional rights. Look at where we are. We need a new narrative about America. He had the best opportunity to say that, but he didn't say that. He hesitated to say that. And I think we debate about why, and I'm sure there's a number of reasons, but I think core is Obama adopted what I'm going to call post-racial politics. Right? And now this is a different sort than just the claim we're post-racial. This is a liberal politics around race. Listen to what it says. Post-racial politics among liberals, and I think this is Democratic Party. I think there's a lot of foundations. I think this is some unions. I think that you see this a lot in universities, right? This is quite widespread. Post-racialism says, yeah, we understand that race is a big problem. But we think that race as a topic is so divisive that we can do more if we just don't talk about race. And we can help minorities more because we can go after general liberal solutions, these sort of universal programs, and we can help the broad population more, right? And so, okay, if that's the rationale, where do we end up? We end up with colorblindness. Because post-racialism says to liberals, stop talking about race. Don't talk about it anymore. We're going to be better off without it, right? And that is, in effect, a liberal version of colorblindness. And I'm afraid for much of his presidency, Obama has adopted a post-racialism which is analogous to a colorblindness, a refusal to talk about race. And that means, and I'll close here, Obama has censored himself, he's hamstrung himself, he has taken away the one thing that he could really do, which is talk about and repudiate the way race is being used to divide us and the way race is being used to defeat liberal government that could actually help the broad middle class.
Wonderful. Well, that's about all the time we have for the chat portion at this time. I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions. If you'd like to raise your hand, I'll bring you a microphone. Just a second.
Hi, how you doing? You have very articulately described the coded racial appeals as deployed by the white majority, the political right, and as well the political left. And I was wondering if you could talk about the deployment of coded racial appeals by minorities themselves.
I think that's a great question, and I'm really glad you asked it. Look, you can understand dog whistle politics in a quite generic way, and it would be appropriate to understand it as political messages that operate in two valences. One audible to a particular segment of the populace, and the other sort of generic and innocuous, right? And in that sense, there's lots of dog whistle politics because we're a highly segmented polity, so there's always going to be, and politicians are quite skilled in speaking in different registers. What's very important about racial dog whistle politics from the right is not just that these are coded appeals, but they're coded appeals that if clearly understood, would be understood to violate essential cultural norms. These are appeals for racial solidarity on the basis of white identity. These are appeals for racial solidarity. So it's not just, this is a code. This is a code that violates our norm of non-racism, that violates our code of racial egalitarianism. So now, when we turn around and we say, when Bill Clinton plays the saxophone, is that a coded appeal to blacks? Or when Obama goes to a black church, isn't that an appeal to blacks? Sure it is. Sure it is. And in some way, you could understand that as dog whistle, it's a special message of affinity, of caring. It flies under the radar for the majority of the audience, but it has special resonance with this segment of the polity. Sure it is. But don't make them symmetrical. There is a chasm between the two. Because one is just a message of special affinity, and the other is a message appealing for solidarity among whites in a way that resonates very uncomfortably with white supremacy. Right? There's really, one is saying, hey, special connection. The other is saying, we whites need to band together against these threatening minorities. And there's a chasm of difference between those two.
Another question over here.
I have two quick questions. So first of all, you're talking about basically a change since 1970, more or less. So I was wondering how you relate the change in politics to economic changes since 1970 with the fall of the Bretton Woods system and the turn to neoliberalism, and how are these connected? And my second question is, when you're talking about the white middle or the white working class, really, and what you're saying, I kind of start thinking about appeals to an argument of false consciousness, and I'm always a little bit skeptical of that argument. So how does one give agency to the white working class, and how does one avoid that charge?
When you said those were quick questions, you meant you could formulate them quickly. Right? But okay, well, I'll belabor both. Look. Yes, there are macro changes in the economy that begin to occur in the 1970s. Yes, there are changes in our political system with the increasing penetration of wealth into our political system. I'm not saying that dog whistle politics is the sole explanation of what has happened to our country over the last 50 years. But I'm saying this sort of racialized conception of government as by and for minorities is crucial to what happens to our politics. And I would dare say it also informs how we respond to other things like these macro changes in the economy. Bill Clinton didn't just end welfare as we know it, didn't just ratchet up the war on crime, but he also launched the United States on an aggressive program of globalization, right, in a way that was very bad for workers. Why was he able to do that? I think in part because the New Democrat was distant not only from minorities but also from union workers, and indeed partly distant from union workers because union workers were increasingly racialized, public union workers in particular, increasingly racialized as minorities, right? So it's not the only reason, but it's an incredibly powerful one, and it's connected to these other developments as well. Okay, false consciousness. I completely agree with you, right? In the sense that false consciousness says, hey, you have a real interest and you're alienated from that real interest because you've been duped. And I think that this is much more complex than that. Indeed, and this is a difficult point, but I think we should be realistic about the idea that some whites do in fact have material interests in white solidarity. If it helps them maintain limited access to schools, to neighborhoods, to employment, they actually have some good interests there. But when we look at how dog whistle politics plays out, it does not track those people who have the strongest material interests. In fact, this is not a phenomena primarily of the white working class, though we tend to default to that story. This is a phenomena of the white middle class who has fled to the suburbs. They actually face very little threat from minorities, and yet they vote as if there are black people and brown people and Muslims and Native Americans pounding at the door at that very minute, right? And so there is a sense in which it's almost it's a sort of a cultural, it's a politically infused cultural fear that is distant from the reality, and it has to be. It has to be. This is not a story about the real threat that minorities pose. This is a story about the way in which people have been convinced that they should act as if they're under siege, when in fact, or I should say, they are under siege, but not from minorities. They're under siege from a government that increasingly serves the very rich with devastating consequences. I mean, a lot of people who are voting their fears, they have a lot to fear. They've lost their jobs. They've seen their wages stagnate or decline. They've seen their public schools lose their quality. They've seen public universities be defunded. There's a lot to fear now. It's just that instead of saying, wow, look at the 1% that's taken 95% of the recovery, look at the 1% that has levels of wealth inequality we haven't seen in 100 years, they say, oh my gosh, the United States is on the cusp of becoming a majority non-white country, right? And that's the line that people are being fed.
Great. Any other questions out there this evening? All right, this is the last one we have time for tonight.
My question is, if instead of your audience being liberal Manhattanites, you were addressing a crowd of middle-class suburban white voters in, Ohio, right? What would you say to them, and how would you convince them to overcome the tropes of dog whistle politics that you chronicle in your book? Speaking directly to them, not to an audience that's familiar with concepts like false consciousness.
Right. I think these have been really wonderful questions, so thank you all. I think this is another really terrific question. I actually think this is, look, in academia, I think the best ideas are what I call obvious ideas. And here's what I mean. They're latent, they're out there, but they don't gel until somebody names them. And then you name them and everybody says, of course that's what's going on, right? And it only becomes obvious once it's named. I think that people they sense that there's something deeply wrong and troubling with the narrative that tells them the United States is in trouble because there's so many minorities. I think people have a strong sense that that's just not quite right. But they need some other way, some other story, before they can say, I'm throwing that aside. I don't want to be associated with that anymore. So I think if I were speaking to this putative audience, this sort of Midwestern Republican audience, I would say something like this. We need to stop for a second and we need to talk about the demographics of the Republican Party. You all know that party's 90% white. You all know 98% of Republican elected officials are white. All persons of goodwill need to stop and ask, how did that happen in a country in which whites are 64% of the population? What is going on? And now, some of you may find this hard to hear. I want to be very clear, this is not a story about bigots. I want to be very clear, it's a story about all of us. I might tell I'll skip it here, we don't have much time, but I would really try and communicate to them, I'm not interested in assigning blame. I'm not interested in looking for bigots. I'm not interested in just throwing race out there to inflame passions. I'm interested in talking to all persons of goodwill who want to know what's happened to our country, who want to know why the middle class is in crisis, who want to know why we have levels of wealth inequality we haven't seen in 100 years. And I want to say to them, as persons of goodwill, we need to stop, we need to slow down, and we need to look at what's happened with the Republican Party, and we need to have a really hard conversation about the work that racial fear is doing, right? And I think that, would I reach them? A few. But I think we start this conversation, we reach the few, and we build from there, and that's how we move forward.
Wonderful. Well, that's all the time we have for this evening. On behalf of the Strand, I'd like to extend a very warm thank you to Heather and Ian, and also, of course, to Rich and the team at Demos who really made this evening happen. If you haven't already checked out a copy of Dog Whistle Politics, we've got a few copies back there by the registers. Everyone have a lovely evening. Thank you.